I'm delighted to welcome you to today's webinar, Critical Perspectives and Qualitative Methods, Introduction, Historical Origins, and Future Possibilities. I'm Ellen Weiss, I'm the Executive Director of CERI, and I could not be more delighted by the overwhelming interest we have had in today's topic. I hope the discussion today will be informative, will start conversations, and will encourage all of us to think about applications in our own work. A few housekeeping notes before I turn it over to CERI board member Lindsay Page, who had the initial idea a year ago to host this series. You'll see a chat on the right-hand side, and we encourage you to use this to share comments throughout the presentation. We also encourage you to start off by introducing yourself so that we know who we're talking to. Throughout the presentation, if you have questions for the panelists, we ask that you click on the Q&A tab that's beside the chat button on the top of that right-hand bar, so that the moderators can easily find those questions and filter them and send them to the panelists at the end of the presentation. With no further ado, I'd like to turn the stage over to Lindsay Page.
Thanks so much, Ellen, and thanks to all of you for taking time to be here with us today. So with generous support from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the webinar series that we are beginning today is part of a larger set of efforts underway at CERI to investigate and foster in our research communities perspectives, strategies, and tools to promote research that is culturally responsive and that works towards the goal of equity in education along dimensions of race, socioeconomic status, and gender, among others. In September, for example, CERI hosted a training on culturally responsive and equitable evaluation. For those of you who are interested in that but were unable to attend the training, please note that you can still register for it on the CERI website and access the session recordings there. Today, we kick off a webinar series on critical perspectives in quantitative research. This series will include 6 sessions over the next 18 or so months, and today begins with an introduction to critical perspectives in quantitative research and methods. Over subsequent sessions, we will dig more deeply into history, applications, and implications for our work moving forward. As social scientists, one thing we are attuned to is heterogeneity. Here, too, there is inevitable variation in the extent to which we each have learned about and engaged with the topics to be addressed in this and subsequent seminars. We intend for today to be an on-ramp of sorts, an opportunity to explore foundational principles and encourage a common vocabulary. While we have designs in the works going forward, we also very much welcome feedback on what you would find most useful for future sessions. To gather this input, just planting a seed, please be on the lookout for a survey next week. Finally, I want to acknowledge Ellen Weiss, Jennifer Cush, and LaShawn Richburg-Hayes for their vision and effort in making this webinar series happen. Extra special thanks to Jason Taylor, Dominique Baker, and Ayin Grooms for their collaboration and careful planning in the ongoing design of this series. And finally, I want to acknowledge our co-sponsors, including AEFP, AERA Division L, and the Council on Public Policy and Higher Education within ASH. We really hope that this and future sessions will be valuable for members of all of these communities. So with that, I will turn it over to my dear friend, Jason Taylor, who will introduce today's speakers.
Thank you, Lindsay, and good afternoon and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name's Jason Taylor. I'm an associate professor of education, leadership, and policy at the University of Utah, which is in Salt Lake City in the ancestral home of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshuti, and Ute tribes. So welcome. I'm really pleased to introduce our first webinar in this series and our esteemed panelists who are joining us. As Lindsay noted, today's webinar is really intended to be an introduction or an entry point to critical perspectives in quantitative research and methods. And our planning team sought out scholars and researchers who have been thinking about and writing about the intersection of quantitative research and critical perspectives in education. So we are really thrilled to welcome Drs. Veronica, Velez, Nichole, Garcia, and Garvey today. Dr. Veronica Velez is an associate professor in secondary education and social justice at Western Washington University. Her research focuses on Latinx immigrant mother activism, community-based participatory action research in grassroots contexts, popular education, and reimagining cartographic tools for movement building and critical inquiry. Each of these areas is informed by expertise in critical race theory, Latinx critical theory, radical tactical cartography, and Chicana feminist epistemologies. Influenced and inspired by these varied but interrelated frameworks, she and her mentor, Dr. Daniel Solorzano at UCLA, developed Critical Race Spatial Analysis, a framework and methodological approach that seeks to deepen a spatial consciousness and expand the use of geographic information systems, or GIS, in critical race research and education. Dr. Velez is a National Academy's Ford Foundation Fellow and a faculty fellow with the American Association of Hispanics in Higher Education, and previously a Spencer Foundation Research Training Grant Fellow. Dr. Velez pursued her graduate studies at UCLA, completing an MA and PhD in social science and comparative education with a specialization in race and ethnic studies. Our second panelist is Dr. Nichole M. Garcia, who is an assistant professor of higher education and college student affairs in the Graduate School of Education at Rutgers University. As a Chicana Puerto Rican, her research focuses on the intersections of race, feminisms of color, and Latinx communities in higher education. Specifically, as a mixed methodologist, she focuses on the differences and similarities between Latinx sub-ethnic groups, students, and families regarding college readiness, retention, and completion. Dr. Garcia was named a 2020 Emerging Scholar Under 40 for diverse issues in higher education, which elects junior scholars of color who are making a significant impact in academia. And Dr. Garcia received her PhD in social science and comparative education with a specialization in race and ethnic studies from UCLA. And our third panelist is Dr. Jason C. Garvey, who is the Friedman, Hips, Green, and Gold Professor of Education and the program coordinator for the Higher Education and Student Affairs Administration program at the University of Vermont. His scholarship, teaching, and service are closely tied to his educational journey as a queer person. His research examines queer and trans collegians across educational contexts, primarily using quantitative methods. In 2020, he launched the Queer and Trans People in Education, a multi-institutional research team with the mission to educate, advocate, and build coalitions that advance equitable policies and practices for queer and trans people in higher education. And Dr. Garvey received his PhD in College Student Personnel Administration from the University of Maryland with a certificate in Measurement, Statistics, and Evaluation. So collectively, these scholars really bring a dynamic range of expertise and knowledge, and we're delighted that they are joining us to kick off the webinar series. So as a reminder, we'll have about 20 minutes at the end of the webinar for Q&A. So please send your questions through the Q&A function as we move through the webinar. And please join me in welcoming Drs. Velez, Garcia, and Garvey with a virtual applause. And we'll turn the time over to them.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you, everybody. It's really lovely to see you all. We're so grateful that you joined us. The three of us wanted to start by grounding ourselves in land and place. I'm speaking to you all from the ancestral homelands of the Abenaki people, which is now known as the state of Vermont. And because this proposed workshop is remote, you're all obviously not occupying the same land. And we also recognize that Indigenous attendees may have different relationships to the lands on which they live. So we wanted to begin by encouraging everyone who is attending here to consider whose land they occupy and to learn more about Indigenous communities. And relevant to this workshop, we believe a lot of lessons we've learned from Indigenous quantitative scholars, particularly regarding data sovereignty and problematizing the concept of data ownership. Secondly, inherent in this proposed workshop are perspectives like critical race theory and intersectionality that acknowledge the intrinsicity of race and racism with other forms of oppression, the centrality of experiential knowledge, which is why we very much foregrounded our personhoods in our introductions, and our responsibility to challenge dominant ideologies and methods. So we wanted to close this introduction by saying we are grateful to Black feminist scholars whose legacies have shaped our understanding of the interconnectedness of structures of inequality, particularly within our approaches to quantitative research.
Thank you, Jay, for that introduction and for grounding us in the space today. I am just simply going to say, as we transition into the presentation this morning, that our hope here is to provide you with an introduction, and I think this was already stated at the beginning, with an introduction to how we engage criticality in our work. We will show you some examples. We will talk a little bit about some of the tensions and the things that we're wrestling with. We'll guide you through a bit of a description and origins around both critical quantitative methods and QuantCRIT. We'll describe that all in a second. But really to ground us that this is meant to be a conceptual anchoring with a little bit of, talking about some methods, but we hope that the rest of the webinar will provide you with the more nuts and bolts of quantitative tools. But our purpose here is really to center the critical and the conceptual aspect that we know are so central to the work we do and how we approach our methodological decision making. So with that said, I'm going to turn over to both Nichole and Jay. We'll start with you, Nichole. We'll turn over to you to give us a bit of a historical grounding of what is the history that informs how we come to you all today and the questions we seek to raise through this work.
Thanks, Vero. Advanced slide, please. All right, so we do not want to approach this as a historical scholars, right? We want to really think about and challenge the notion of objectivity. And so we want to talk about an historical example of how white logic and white methods have been used in terms of quantitative research as weapons that wound. So here we see Sir Francis Galton. If you pay really close attention, you can see a founder of eugenics, and above that is a statistician. So we cannot enter the world of thinking about critical quantitative methods or QuantCRIT without acknowledging and grounding that this was really a part of a movement to uphold white supremacy, race, and racism that then was masked in stats, right, as a way to think about and move forward to keep communities of color and people of color inferior to white, hetero, cisgender men, right? And so that's really something that we want to pay attention to moving forward. Oftentimes people do not know that Francis Galton was the cousin of Darwin, which is the survival of the fittest. So historical narrative is really important. We know this because we get a lot of this information from sociologists of color that have been doing this work, notably W. Du Bois since 1899 with the Philadelphia Negro, where he's really pushing and challenging how we think about mixed method studies in relation to the Black community in Philadelphia and the data portraits that were being created at the time. And so we really have to problematize and think about the ethics of doing harm. What are the ethics behind quantitative research, and how do we challenge them now in current day practice? And so one thing that we should think about also is who's taking up this work currently and how we lend ourselves. And we'll talk through a couple examples of how we got to our work and really special issues that are coming out. But white logic, white methods really comes out of sociologists of color that have been doing the work since early 2000s and a little prior, specifically to Kufu Zuberi and Eduardo Bonesilva, who write this collection and edited volume around this. And then I would credit a lot of the historical perspectives on stats coming from Tufuku Zuberi and Thicker Than Blood, How Racial Statistics Lie, which he discusses in a 2001 book. And much more is coming out currently. I'll turn it over to you, Jay.
Thanks, Nichole. Wanted to provide a little bit more historical context. So as Nichole mentioned, Galton, a driving force of modern stats in social science research, perpetuated the false notion that genius and success were innate and inherited traits of white men, and that those could be measured statistically to reinforce racial dominance. And these dangerous assertions supported his conceptual foundation of eugenics, where he claimed the superiority of white Europeans and a gradation of racial inferiority derived from white supremacy. We also want to bring in Carl Pearson, who worked very closely with Galton and is largely considered one of the founders of modern statistics. Pearson used questionable and biased methods to support eugenics and British nationalism when researching British Jewish school children. And he published a series of articles with his co-author, Margaret Moole, in the Annals of Eugenics, which is now known as the Annals of Human Genetics, of which he was the founder and editor. And these articles are, of course, now contemporarily critiqued as racially prejudiced with goals of promoting genetic inferiority of Jews. As we write in this slide, white supremacist notions of objectivity and impartiality and truth with a capital T continue to permeate how we apply and even teach statistics in education, which makes it really difficult to introduce critical theories within quantitative methods. Because if critical quantitative work is rooted in the premise that statistics are not neutral and researchers are therefore subjectively interpreting numbers, then we must continually recognize and move towards dismantling the historical remnants and the current harm that white supremacy has perpetuated through stats. And this is a really deep claim to make, because doing so would require us to ultimately unsettle and rebuild the entire foundation of statistics as we use it currently. I'll pass it off to the next slide. Great.
It's actually continuing with both you and Nichole, and I'm going to jump in a little bit around QuantCRIT, but I thought if you can start us off continuing on and talking about critical quant and the special issue.
Perfect.
Sorry, Jake. One thing to mention to the audience is QR codes so you can scan the bodies of work that we're talking about as a reference point. Sorry, Jake. Go ahead.
Thanks, Nichole. Dream team. For a lot of us who study critical quantitative perspectives or QuantCRIT specifically, there are two hallmark publications that really set the stage for a lot of our work, no pun intended, because Fran Stage and Ryan Wells are the two editors of these volumes. Not too long ago, they published two special issues in New Directions for Institutional Research, where they grounded us conceptually in critical quantitative inquiry. Their main audiences were education researchers and institutional researchers working at colleges and universities. I briefly want to share some major contributions that I see from these publications. First is a bold assertion that justice is core to our role as educational researchers. The second is that we must use identity and community-centered inquiry to illuminate inequities and to transform policy and resource reallocation. The third that I often reference, and I think the three of us will talk about later, is being adaptive to, rather than dismissive of, the potentials of quantitative methods for justice. In these special issues, there's a strong emphasis on uplifting Black, Indigenous, and people of color, namely students and also communities broadly. I would say that these special issues were striving towards examining multiple identities. And I'm being specific in my word choice because I don't think they reached multiple identities quite so much in the special issue, nor did they embrace intersectionality as a framework. Most of the emphasis in these uplifted concepts centered on race and racism and anti-Blackness. And there's less of an emphasis on disability justice or gender and sexuality justice. For me, and Vera and Nichole may have nuanced perspectives on this, I might consider these special issues beginning conversations towards strong equity-driven research, striving towards justice and liberation-centered scholarship, but not quite reaching that threshold, which, not to spoil it too much, is a slippery slope in itself to say that there's a threshold of criticality in the work that we're doing. But I'm going to pass it off to Nichole to continue the legacy of QuantCRIT.
Thank you, Jay. Yeah, I think you make a really interesting point just now around the progress towards liberation and justice. And our special issue on QuantCRIT, I say our as collaborating with Vero, who's on the panel, and Nancy Lopez, is really starting with the genealogy of critical race theory, which comes out of critical legal studies and then transgresses in the 1980s in critical legal studies, critical race studies obviously emerges. And then in education in the 1990s, Latent, Billings, and Solorsen will take it up again for us to revisit. One of the special issues that came out before quantitative was the qualitative special issue on how do we think about critical race theory in relation to qualitative methods? What kind of questions do we need to ask and interrogate, specifically around racism, anti-racism work? So in this special issue, we were really aware that it was in its infancy. We did not claim to know everything. We wanted to actually ask critical questions around how do we center a critical race perspective, and can we even center it to really address and think about interrogating quantitative methods who have historically been there to wound communities of color. And so this is the birth of the special issue. We were at a conference in which I think 3 or 4 papers in which was actually in the special issue. We had been asked to present, did not know that we were going to be together. And it so happened that we were all on a panel. And then David Gilborn, which we talked about in the special issue, was there as the editor of Race, Ethnicity, and Education and asked us if we wanted to advance this. I was very fortunate because at that time I was a graduate student, ABD, thinking about this work. And was really led by Veronica, who's on the panel, who had been doing this work since the early 2000s. So Vedo, I'll let you take over from here about how you paved the way for me to be here with you.
No, it's always collective endeavors. I mean, that's the beauty of being part of a beautiful critical race community in education. I think that our commitment to justice means our commitment to building collectives that can interrogate this work as an ongoing process. So to Jay's point, I completely agree. This is an entry. And I think we're building critical communities to continue to interrogate, particularly around how we may have, we're not thinking about questions of disability or questions of sexuality in relationship to race in ways that we need to interrogate, particularly around methods. And so I think the point you raised, Jay, is so important for us to think about that there's still so much room for growth in here. But we began doing, I think the special issue was informed by work that was coming out of UCLA, particularly through our mentor, our shared mentor with Nichole, Dr. Danny Solorsen, around educational pipelines. And it was sort of the first time that many of us were actually working with things like the census and things like big data and thinking like, can these data sets help us tell a story about what is happening in terms of educational attainment particularly among Chicanas and Chicanos, and thinking about the complexities of those experiences. And, the pipelines definitely got a lot of pushback. It was a lot of a very sort of, people could say it was homogenizing data, but we had a lens that was very centered, not just on race, but on racism. And we knew that the structures that were impeding progress across the educational pipeline were deeply rooted in these structural conditions. So we continue to play with it and wrestle with it. And the pipelines became the first opportunity that many of us had that were working at UCLA to think about numbers, to think about, can numbers help us tell the story? To what extent can it help us tell the story? And even asking some things like, are the numbers enough? And wrestling with some of the complexities around that. And I think that was some of the kind of the precursor to some of the work that we did in the special issue. So that just kind of gives you a little bit of a scope. We hope that you'll get a chance to download these and read them, and hopefully continue to engage with us as we also continue to develop the work. But just to give a little bit of snapshot that these special issues were groundbreaking. They're not enough, but they're at least a starting point for us to think about criticality in quantitative research. Now I'm going to turn over back to, so this is the question we're all asking ourselves, like what in the notion of criticality are we talking about, right? And so now I'm going to give us a chance for each of us to go into a little bit more in depth. So we've given you a chance to sort of explore, think about these special issues that have been groundbreaking, but we want to go in and define these approaches a little bit further. And so I'm going to turn it back to you, Jay, to kind of get us going on quantitative criticalism, and then we'll turn to QuantCRIT and we'll talk about how these two are similar and a little bit different, but turn it over to you.
Can I just say one thing before we get into that, is that often right now, I think we're seeing this shift where they are being conflated around how we understand them and the epistemologies or the ways of knowing and how we enter this research, right? And so we are here to kind of critique, bring tensions and contradictions up to how we are understanding criticality in relation to the quant part of that. So I'll just say that, and Jay, go forward.
Yes, thank you. So I'm going to broadly overview what we would consider a big umbrella called quantitative criticalism. And in its most basic sense, quant criticalism combines an understanding and use of both methods and epistemologies. Whereas quant research historically emerged from positivism with goals of minimizing bias, quantitative criticalists examine phenomena rooted in positionality and subjectivity while also advocating for justice and dismantling of oppression. And that's directly from Carter and Hurtado's insights in the first special issue by Stage and Wells. Critical quantitative scholars challenge existing policies and theories and frameworks and measures and re-examine what some might consider traditional questions for populations that are marginalized in the academy. And in 2007, in the special issue, Stage wrote, "As quantitative researchers, we are uniquely able to find those contradictions and negative assumptions that exist in quantitative research frames." Jenna Sablin is a fantastic quantitative criticalist researcher and a friend of mine, and she defined critical approaches to quantitative methods as one that recognizes students holistically and within systems rather than as individuals with deficits. This approach to quantitative criticalism speaks to the overarching structure of oppression and inequity versus individualistic determination in how we frame, interpret, and approach our research. A lot of critical quantitative work is concerned with the premise that numbers are not neutral and that analyses must account for systemic oppression, and that descriptive statistics and visual presentations of descriptive stats can unearth counter stories of students and their trajectories through education. I would argue that quantitative methods should not focus solely on data generation and analyses. So for me, embracing quantitative criticalism requires that I engage in a justice-driven process throughout the entire design and production of a study, from developing my questions to making meaning of my results and offering implications, from even the motivation for me pursuing an idea and my intentions to data collection and analysis, even to my choice of manuscript publication. As quantitative criticalists, we must embrace tenets of criticality throughout the entire lifespan of a research project. And if we are truly to embrace justice-driven scholarship, then we must attend to the inequities and embedded oppression within every facet of our research process, including how we articulate our positionalities, factor and construct development, measurement and variable operationalization, sampling and data collection, even coding and cleaning. Every aspect of the research design should have a lens of criticality. And when I mentioned the lifespan of a research project, I'm considering both the requisite components of a manuscript as well as the process of us conducting scholarship. And so for many of us, for Veronica, Nichole, and I, we approach quantitative criticalism with solidarity and love and alignment for communities that we care about and that we belong to that are often violently and systematically oppressed and excluded in higher education. So not only is community involvement and solidarity an important aspect of quantitative criticalism, but we also have to understand with whom we're in relationship. In other words, who is our intended audience? So our implications can have meaningful push towards liberatory practice. Relatedly, in my opinion, researchers' choice of venue to publish empirical work can have a lot of importance when considering the range and scope of impact for quantitative scholarship. There's other things that are often overlooked. As we mentioned, I've learned a great deal from Indigenous scholars about data storage, access, and stewardship, especially giving data hoarding, paying for data, data extraction, very much aligning with a settler colonizer mentality among quant data collectors. And then finally, I just want to mention that given the hierarchical power structures and dominant discourse within collaboration and education research, especially when we involve faculty and graduate students and practitioner scholars and community members, I find that transparency in authorship order and requisite manuscript responsibilities is another important dimension of quantitative criticalism, because understanding our positionalities and social identities relative to the power that we hold on a research team must be at the forefront of our process to promote sustainable, healthy, enduring, solidarity-driven partnerships, especially when we're doing community-engaged research. I'll pass it off to you, Nichole.
Thanks, Jay. I think you lend yourself a lot to QuantCRIT as well. You had beautifully put a lens of criticality, right, and how we enter this work. And so we want to pay homage. While Gilborn and his colleagues coined QuantCRIT in 2018, Stage had set a stage around how do we engage in criticality in the early 2000s. At the same time that those pipelines are being generated out of UCLA with the critical race lens. So it's really important to think about that intellectual genealogy that we often as peer reviewers who are in academic journals do not see happen. And Vero and I talk a lot about this, like where is the erasure that's happening? Because Gilborn intentionally asked all of us as women of color to come and write this special issue and bring together our colleagues. Because so often you're talking about positionality, Jay. As women of color, we were told we couldn't do numbers. But we knew that numbers existed and we had a personal reflective relationship with them. And now how do we take the tools and retool them to reimagine something that works for us and our communities? And so I think QuantCRIT really asks those structural questions around how white supremacy, race, and racism have then been practiced and exclude us, but then how do we retool it and reimagine it? And can we even do that, right? And so these are working, I would argue, working tenets that Vero has written about too extensively. So the first one, I'll let her explain and we'll talk back and forth around this.
Yeah, so the first sort of guiding tenet, and again, this is, we use tenets because we derive this from critical race theory, which also uses tenets and principles in the work. And that's not, immune from critique either around how tenets can be deployed. But this is something that is, again, because of its alignment to CRT, is important to us. So the first one being the centrality of racism as a complex and deeply rooted aspect of society that is not readily amenable to quantification. And so what QuantCRIT recognizes is that racism is complex, it's fluid, and it's a changing characteristic of society in the world that is not automatically amenable to statistical inquiry. And we would argue that QuantCRIT scholars, at core to their argument, is that with the absence of a critical race conscious perspective, your analysis can often remake and often legitimize existing racial inequities. So we understand that race is simply more than a variable, and we'll get into more of that a little bit in our unpacking here. It is more than a methodological statement; it's a political statement that is integral to CRT's model of the social and how we understand how that social connects to education. So every attempt to measure the social in relation to race can only offer, some would argue, a crude approximation that risks misunderstanding and misrepresenting the true nature of the social dynamics that are at play. So in view of this, QuantCRIT scholars encourage folks who are thinking about using quantitative methods to begin by interrogating the collection, analysis, and representation of statistical material for likely bias in favor of upholding the racial status quo. And so this becomes, again, such a core part, like how do we center race and racism, but really it's the racism that becomes important, because I feel like quantitative scholars are really good about using race as a variable, but it's really the racism that becomes the central lens that guides a QuantCRIT perspective.
Thank you, Vero. Second, we really want to acknowledge that numbers are not neutral. So taking a historical perspective can be very harming depending on who you and what you are talking about. And they should be interrogated for their role in promoting deficit analysis that serve white racial interests. We would like to say that the special issue, again, is in its infancy. It does a survey of how we're entering and thinking about critical race theory in relationship with quantitative methods. It does not do everything. And when we say deficit analysis, numbers can purport different stories, right? They may have the same outcome, but the stories behind those numbers are what we're really trying to think about. And are they in the interest, again, of white folks or not? And what are we trying to dismantle? We would also, I say we, me and Beto, but also a part of critical race theorists and being critical race feminist theorists, is thinking about the genealogy behind it, right? And that critical race theorists not only talk about race, there is that intersection of oppression. And I think that's a common misunderstanding that folks think about, is that, oh, it's only race and racism. No, there are shoots off of race and of critical race theory that happens. And then how do we multi-layer these understandings and intellectual genealogies to then have a process towards social justice and liberation? We'll go to the next tenet, Beto.
Yeah, thank you. So the third tenet is again, troubling that notion that categories, and we're going to spend a little bit of time, I think our application really wrestles with this notion of how do we categorize and look at data, but that these are not natural nor given. And that we need to critically evaluate the units that we operationalize in our work. And so here the argument is that QuantCRIT argues that the nature and consequences of the categories we use are imperative, right? It's really not so much, I think about this in the context of the how. We oftentimes can engage, the different sort of social locations, if you will, or these demographics. I work a lot with census data, so my mind goes there, right? But it's really like how these are constructed. And it's a little complicated. I mean, we won't get into it too much here today, but if it's one thing if you're collecting your own data, it's a whole other thing if you're working with someone else's data, or we know as secondary data. It gets a lot more complicated when we didn't get a chance to even construct the instrument. So how do we interrogate and kind of work through that? But the question really is really an important one for this third tenet, because, for example, you can imagine a study where we had a comparison point, and usually white students or white communities tend to be the sort of the anchor comparison point for other communities of color. And we tend to lump communities of color. Oftentimes we do this, right? We lump them into one group and do a comparison, and then no results come out. But if we were actually to tease apart some of those categories, look at things a bit more intersectionally, it may mean that when we compare with immigrant students, when we compare with Black students, all of a sudden there are some statistical findings there that we need to wrestle with. So what happens when we choose to categorize our data in a particular way? And what happens when we don't find a finding when we do that? What does it mean does it mean something about the social phenomena under study, or does it mean that we didn't operationalize our data or our categories in a more critical or nuanced way? So here, I think that the important thing to take away is the how we categorize. It becomes really critical in a QuantCRIT framework.
Right. So the data, right? The fourth tenet that we think about, or the principle, is the recognition that voice and insight are vital and data cannot speak for itself, and critical analysis should be informed by the experiential knowledge of marginalized group. So for example, we were talking about census data and how it's secondary data sample. We are not on the ground talking to these communities, right? We're generating this data that's offering a descriptive analysis and then assuming for these communities that X, Y, and Z is occurring without actually asking the why, right? The how, the what, the why it's happening. And so QuantCRIT really wants to ground the data portraits, but then those voices behind the numbers, right? What is the holistic understanding of the communities we're studying, and why is it needed? What is the end point? How do we liberate these communities from race, racism, white supremacy, so that it gives that voice, right, and leverages? We don't want to we don't want to speak for other folks. We want to uplift and leverage their voices in relation to how we're thinking about quantitative methods. And we are giving descriptive examples, but we can talk further in application.
Yeah. And then the last tenet for QuantCRIT is this commitment to social and racial justice. And it does this largely by critiquing the official analyses that trade on deficit assumptions and working with minoritized communities and activist groups to provide more insightful, sensitive, and useful research that adds a quantitative dimension to anti-oppressive praxis. So those interested in using quantitative methods, for QuantCRIT, QuantCRIT scholars would argue that it's critical to adopt a position of principled ambivalence. So neither rejecting numbers out of hand, nor falling into the trap of imagining that numerical data have any kind of enhanced status, value, or neutrality. This is a stance that anti-racist scholars and activists have long practiced. For example, when they contest supposedly scientific claims about the biological nature of race. So QuantCRIT should work with against numbers by engaging with statistics as a fully social aspect of how race and racism is constantly made and legitimated in society. And the hope is that policymakers' preference, which we sometimes know this all too well in education, for numbers might offer a role for statistics in the radical critique of white supremacy. So as we kind of laid out, we know we kind of provided you quite a bit in terms of thinking about both quantitative criticalism and QuantCRIT. And so we thought we would have a bit of just a discussion among us. And we've talked about some of these questions because we know that we have a desire to think, we're anchored in our critical frameworks, and we have desire to kind of reimagine quantitative approaches, but we struggle. There's moments where there are tensions and contradictions in the work that we also wanted to expose and make evident for you all that are listening in as we think about this. So I'm going to open up for the three of us to think about this. Maybe let's start with the first question, which has been on my mind actually most recently with the recent paper that Nichole and I worked on together. But, can quantitative methods stand alone? And so I'm going to just open up the floor. I don't know if Jay or Nichole, if you want to jump in here real quick and share your thoughts on this question.
Go ahead, Jay, if you want to. I can definitely.
I love this whole thing. I'm just imagining the three of us sitting around a coffee shop, just like shooting our shots, talking about liberation and justice and numbers. So welcome everyone to the beautifulness of our group friendship. Okay, so Vero, say quant methods for me are meant to demonstrate trends and immediate impact for decision makers. The reason I'm drawn to quant methods is because I've been in conversations with senior leadership at institutions and institutional and state legislators who are trying to just absorb a lot of information all at once. And I feel like it can have a great impact in those moments. Where I feel tension is that I don't think they should stand alone, but the way that we absorb and I digest them makes it difficult when we add complexity to our storylines. So I think a lot of decision makers are looking for those crisp, deficit-based disparities to push policy and resource reallocation. And as a queer person, I want to push against that to recognize the beautiful blessings that queer, trans, and non-binary people bring without having to be compared to cis hetero people. Mm-hmm. I think for me, as a quantitative scholar and an aspiring mixed methodologist, the way that I approach it is by adding open-ended responses in my surveys. And I'm just going to draw a clear line. I don't see this as mixed methods research. I see it as quantitative research with narrative additions from respondents. And the reason that I like doing this is to upset the white dominance in queer and trans research, the overrepresentation of white cis people in scholarship centering on gender and sexuality. So whereas I might have a large trend to discuss queer students, I could then supplement it by saying an agender, first generation Latinx student wrote this regarding climate. And so it can provide just a little bit more human voice and narrative inquiry after saying, well, here's what the structural equation model said about these large scale relationships between climate, retention, and queer phobia.
That's so powerful, Jay. Yeah, I mean, I can jump in here, Nichole, and feel free to interrupt me and add, because we've been working on a few projects together around this. And, I couldn't agree more, Jay. I think that, what does it mean to create, and this is one of the things I'm constantly wrestling with, because we know that numbers grab people's attention, and I do GIS work. So I feel like maps even sometimes can even more grab people because they're pretty and they're nice to look at. And they're this gee whiz display of data that people get really excited about, right? But no one ever troubles the map maker or asks whether the map maker, what were the kind of biases or intentions that the map maker had in making the maps, right? And so I know that there's a danger in the display of data. At the same time, I feel like part of what I wrestle with is that even if we include the qualitative components, that depending on the audience, they'll gravitate to the numbers, right? And so I'm having to wrestle with, how do I continue to find ways to reimagine what the numbers can do, what the methods can do behind, as we engage in the analyses. Because I know that even if I provide a more deep portrait, like they're going to look at the numbers and pull those numbers out. And it's something that I'm struggling with at the moment, like how to do that, and I'm curious for both of you, right? Because it's a lot of it is also dealing with audience. Because if we're in community and I show some cool graphs, that's gonna propel a lot of rich story, a lot of rich challenges to the data. It becomes a dialogue with the data. And now that becomes powerful for me, right? But if we're showing our research to policymakers or to certain audiences, certain things get cut out, right? They sort of pick and choose. It's a different ballgame. So audience becomes a really important point for me when I think about this question.
Yeah, just to chime in, I think, who are we doing this work for and with, right? As you both are pointing out. Jay, you named policy makers and decision makers as one. I think one thing that I've learned specifically from Vero is like, how do we reclaim our mathematical genius, which comes out of Indigenous scholars in math, right? Within communities that are told that you don't do well in these subjects. And then how do you then reclaim them for your own and use them? So in those notions, I don't think quantitative methods stand alone. I would say I'm a mixed methodologist in training. I don't think you're always an expert in either or. And even within the mixed methods world, there's debate on what that actually means and looks like and who is what and how hard it is. Creswell, Mertens, they go back and forth, right? But I do think that the objectives and the communities I'm working and a part of is really important. So like, for instance, back in when I was doing my dissertation work in 2015, there was no disaggregation of Latinx that really spoke to the differences between Puerto Ricans and Mexican Americans. That's crazy to think about. So having a higher ed data set that just disaggregated that wasn't enough. I had to go talk to the folks. And there were so many complexities that came out of that then I have to go back and I'm responsible for. But for me, thinking about survey research design, it starts with that qualitative component and then thinking about items and how they're conceptualized and asking folks, does this make sense to you, right? So it's a cyclical process that is really important. And I think the second question, critical theories and quantitative approaches, we're just scratching that surface. And so I'm interested to think about what are the challenges? You talked about intersectionality, Jay, and I'm like, are we getting away from what Kimberly Crenshaw really wanted, right? Or are we helping leverage what the intent was in the legal system for Black women who were experiencing this, right? So all of these contradictions and tensions we're wrestling with.
So I'm curious, Jay, if you wanted to jump in to that second question, because I know that there's been this tension, right? Like we operate at the interstice and the in-between between critical theories and quantitative approaches. And I'm curious for you, what are some of the challenges that have kind of risen up from that, as Nichole was kind of alluding to?
Okay, so I'm an emotional queer. I'm a Cancer, very much driven by my emotions. And so the first thing I'm going to say is, oh my gosh, we should continue to have these coffee dates because my mind is spinning right now with just complexities and questions, which very much speaks to what I'm going to talk about with the second question. I'm a community-driven researcher. I am in education because of love and solidarity and kinship and community. And I mean, real talk, a desire to be a part of something bigger than my profession and my institution for liberation and social change. And as an emotional queer Cancer, I think the biggest challenge for me is that within queer scholarly communities, my quantitative research is also often seen as essentializing and limiting and devoid of community and devoid of emotions. And Vero, I think you mentioned intentions. I try to speak my intentions very explicitly in my scholarship by positioning myself and my communities, and it doesn't always translate. And so I think about Gloria Anzaldúa a lot when talking about QuantCRIT and quantitative criticalism, because this border that we're occupying makes me feel both within and outside of communities that I deeply care about. And even in quantitative spaces, folks, I mean, you just heard me talk. Folks think I'm too emotional, that I'm too identity driven, and that my research is not objective. And so I think the challenge for me as a quantitative queer, because we are a small but mighty group, is just developing capacity and building coalitions with folks who understand the beautiful messiness of sitting at the intersection of critical thought and liberation and quantitative research.
Yeah.
That's great. Can I add to that real quick? Thank you for sharing that. I think you're bringing up, we're talking about women of color genealogies that base and have been theorized from the body, right? From the flesh, theory in the flesh, as Andal say, and Sherry Moraga. I think one thing with the challenges of operating at the intersection of critical theories and quantitative approaches is that folks may not take the time to learn the critical theories. And that is very dangerous to do because quantitative approaches need to be married with the critical theory. And just as much time as you take the quantitative work, you must take with the critical theories. So just to slap on intersectionality and do a grouping, it's not enough for a race variable, right? Or I can't speak today. It's been a long day. But you know what I mean? So I think the critical theories, like you're talking about the borderlands, we see a lot of generating of critical theories that should be matched with quant methods and vice versa. But are we really, really interrogating the epistemologies that we're asking, right? And so Vero and I are working on a paper, or actually submitted, can numbers be race and gendered, right? Are we thinking about it with the Chicano Latina feminist lens? And are we going to get pushback? Absolutely. Because is that dangerous to do? Maybe we're ready to see how it is taken within our communities. But yes, doing the numbers is really an interesting task. And I don't think I would apply a Black feminist perspective because that's not my reality. While I know about it, I'm not sure I could put it and apply it in a quantitative method to understand things. So I cut you off.
No, you're fine. I was, I think, for me, to kind of your point, Jay, I mean, I come out of also 15 years of working in a grassroots organizations, particularly around mother activism. And one of the things that was really hard for me is that, when I started learning computational technologies, which at the heart use, so computational technologies like GIS or digital map making that rely on quantitative methods. And I began to put them in an organizing context. The mothers, the migrant mothers that I worked with, jumped in. They're like, we need to use this. This is a tool for our organizing work. This will spur a particular kind of dialogue that will open up the possibility for us to interrogate our histories, interrogate the spatial distribution of resources. And it just became this thing where I saw activist groups also leaning into some of this work. And I knew I had to be careful. I had a particular responsibility coming from the academy to show and to engage the pitfalls of research and to have those honest conversations with community groups. But I was troubled, right? And partly because my critical communities were saying, you need to not touch quantitative numbers with a 10-foot pole, right? Because how can you possibly use them to talk about nuance? How can you possibly engage them to tell these more complicated portraits? But then working with the mothers and having the opportunity to wrestle with these tensions and show how they wanted to map themselves, how they wanted to use numbers to tell their stories, began to kind of open for me the possibility that we can't just ignore this. We can't just throw out the quantitative. I think there's a possibility here to wrestle with things, largely because can we use it as a mobilizing tool? In what ways can that be possible? How do we approach it, right? And so when I saw the community groups really driving this, it gave me some strength to sort of engage with this and being like, we have to think differently about this. And is there room for a quantitative portrait of our realities? And so I think we're still wrestling with this because I think we get pushback on both ends. We get pushback from the quantitative folks that we're not, quote unquote, rigorous or unbiased. And then we get pushback from the critical theory folks who are like, you are not being nuanced enough. And this is not, this is a problem. And we're trying to create imagine the space in between that allows us to think deeply about the possibility, right? And I think that's a question mark. We're still wrestling with, can we do this? How do we do this? which I think leads me to my last question. And I think, Jay, this was really your beautiful question that you put forth. And I'm curious, again, as you think about this, but how do we address these methodological tensions of generalizability, this kind of operationalizing of identity, and creating these, and if you can talk a little bit what you mean by a latent construct related to oppression, power, and privilege.
Yes, this is where I love to chew on some of these methodological considerations. The first is, I think generalizability is a fallacy driven by white supremacy, and that if we continue to emphasize its utility in quantitative methods, it's only benefiting people in power. And I'm going to use queer and trans people as an example. As a higher ed researcher, I had to be scrappy in my doctoral training because at the time, the National Survey of Student Engagement, the Higher Ed Research Institute, and 0 federal data sets included demographic variables to be able to identify queer and trans people. So if we are saying that generalizability and representativeness of data is important, and we don't know the demographic composition of queer and trans students in the United States, how can we even approach generalizability and representativeness in our research? And so it's like this gatekeeping that completely excludes queerness and transness from all quantitative inquiry. I'm going to jump to operationalizing social identities and talk about iPads for a little bit and how it irks me to no end. I don't know if a lot of you know this. iPads.
Can you define what iPads are?
Yes, thank you. Okay, tell me if I get it wrong. The Integrated Secondary Education Data Set is administered by the federal government that is basically like an institutional data set. They have a gender question that they misappropriately assign. It's really they're asking sex, composition of students, and institutions have to register whether a student identifies as male or female. Did you know that iPads, if a student chooses not to put male or female, it literally says take the average sex composition of your school and assign a sex to that student?
Wow.
What? So all of those policies so closely relate to non-discrimination in education for trans and non-binary people, the huge implications for Title IX legislation right now. And we are saying to institutions, just arbitrarily designate a sex marker for students' genders, which I think is so wild. And the third thing that I'll briefly mention is latent constructs. I think we're doing a great job at measuring interpersonal inequity dynamics like climate, belongingness. And I mean, I really lean on people like Sylvia Hurtado and Sue Rankin, where my work is very much built on the constructs that they developed. Where I think we need to go, however, is moving beyond interpersonal dynamics of oppression into creating constructs through latent variables, operationalizing factors, so we can have more deep conversations about oppression, power, and privilege. But that would require that we don't focus solely on people. We also focus on institutions and systems. And I'm going to make the argument that, especially in higher education, we do a really great job collecting student level, person level data. But where can we go to understand institution and systems-based variables besides iPads, which is just so wickedly normative that it doesn't really have consequential impact on identity-based scholarship?
Yeah, no, I think that's, and can you talk just a tiny bit more when you talk about latent constructs for the folks who don't know what a latent construct is? Can you just describe that for them, just so that they get a sense of when we're saying related to power, privilege, and oppression? Because I think that's such an important tension that I want to make sure we drive that home.
Oh, yes, great point. I'm going to give a clear example. Campus climate. I'm a campus climate scholar. And so campus climate is something that isn't discernible by just measuring it. And so researchers create latent variables to operationalize that using a series of Likert type questions. I feel safe in this space. I feel valued as a queer person. My mentors value my perspectives. All of those are getting at this concept that we might call campus climate that we can't exactly measure, but we're almost trying to develop a series of questions to get as close as possible to a construct that isn't discernible from observation. And that's what latent constructs are. And you can see how difficult that would be when entering into arena like using Kimberly Crenshaw's intersectionality theory to understand oppression for Black women.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, no, that's sort of problem. And in some way, this question of constructs and how we operationalize variables is going to be a great entryway into the example. So I'm hoping we'll transition here now. But what you just shared, Jay, was so powerful. And Nichole, thank you so much for doing this little I would say pani cafe, a little baby chat. Like, I wish we had coffee here to just continue this conversation going. But let's transition and provide the audience with a little bit of an example, just to again, this is just a beginning stage, thinking about how in one particular project that I did with the colleagues that's actually in the QuantCRIT series, how we wrestled with that, how we wrestled with the notion of how do we operationalize variables. And so again, there's a QR code that Nichole did a fabulous job of providing for us, for all of you. So if you want to scan that article will also pop up on your phone or your devices. So I'll give you a second to scan that. But let me just provide some context as to what the study was designed to do. So in a nutshell, we were interested in looking at the value. What is the value of a college degree? And it actually, this whole project began actually with a conversation among myself, my colleague, Dr. Lindsay Perez-Huber, and our shared mentor, Dr. Danny Solórzano. And it began through story. We were having a conversation about whether or not we should put up our diplomas in our office, and whether or not that was something that, we have mixed feelings about this thing called the papelito, or this degree that we had, because we know that while it symbolized struggle and, it's a source of pride for a lot of our families, it also is a signal of who didn't get a chance to go on and for what reasons, and how do we trouble schooling. And so we just had this kind of troubled relationship. And so it began by talking about, well, what does it mean to have a college degree? But it began through the stories of our own families, right? And what value meant to us and how we should approach this. And this was, again, coming off the work we were doing around these educational pipelines that basically take U.S. Census data and determine that for every 100 students based on particular social identity. So in our case, it was really ethno-racial categories. So Latinx, Black, Asian American, again, those should be troubled even further for sure. But it began with looking at that data and then looking at, based on those that actually achieve a bachelor's degree, where do they go on to work? What's the value of that college degree for attaining, particular kinds of occupations? So that was really the nutshell. It was kind of the next step in our educational pipeline analysis work. And we wanted to determine, where to go next with it. And so the first step in our process, we began looking at, okay, are there measures that exist out there that measure occupation, and in particular, occupational prestige? And so what we came across was the Duncan Index. And the Duncan Index is really, we came to find out was constructed particularly on data from white cis men that have at least a high school education and income of, at the time, this is in 1947, an income of at least $3,500 or more. And that they found that there were some significant correlations between income, public ranking of occupational prestige, and this an educational level. And so they found that the Duncan Index was a pretty robust measure of which occupations are prestigious in the world and in U.S. society. Now, the Duncan Index, while it's sort of evolved, and there have been additional studies that have come on to kind of expand in space, it still holds, I would say, prominence in the field of occupational measures. And so in 1989, the National Opinion Research Council, known as NORC, provided a new index, kind of developed again from this Duncan Index, and it provided the following list of 20 most prestigious, did I do something? There we go. The 20 most prestigious occupations. And these still continue to hold. Some may be pretty familiar to those of you in the audience who are listening in. And often they're very much tied to notions of capitalism and what holds high-paying jobs, right? But these were also, I remember, definitely positions that I heard when I was going through elementary school. Teachers telling me, like, Vero, if you work hard enough, and I actually was in engineering for 3 years before leaving that whole situation and moving on to other things. But part of it was, I remember those messages. They were not just coded messages about college going. They were coded messages about the types of occupations that would provide you a good life. And we never troubled the measures. We never troubled what was underneath it. So So in this, we're like, okay, so these are the measures, and we know now. We're curious, right? Because how does this play out in our communities? And is this the right measure that we should have? So we ended up working with secondary data, U.S. Census American Community Survey data, and we began to think about, how can this data help us in telling a different story about what is the value of our college degrees and in what way can they tell us something about the occupations. Now, the data can only tell you so much, but we were beginning to kind of, to Jay's point, like thinking about, like, is this a starting point for us to begin to interrogate, at least disrupt this notion of the Duncan Index? And so what we ended up doing, did I went a little bit too far here? We ended up doing an exploratory factor analysis. So let me just describe for a second, and it's going to be just, again, a pretty basic definition. But a factor analysis is a way of taking a mass of data. And in this case, we were working with one particular variable that looked at all the occupations, sort of an occupational category variable. It's about 484 occupations that the US Census collects data on. And we were looking at that data set across the US. And we wanted to shrink it into sort of smaller data sets that are more manageable and understandable. So we were looking at how do we take a race lens to unpack this and to think about, are there hidden patterns, and how can we show how those patterns overlap and what characteristics are seen in multiple forms. So it really is about, factor analysis is a really useful tool for complex sets of data, oftentimes psychological studies, socioeconomic, other sort of involved concepts. And it just allows us to kind of unpack and begin to look at other kinds of patterns in the data. And so when we did that, when we employed a factor analysis, we realized that actually the top ranking professions across, and we only showed these three groups for the purpose of today as an example, begin to tell a different story, right? So yes, while we see some of those Duncan Index prestige occupations in the rankings, we started noticing that for communities, in this case, we were looking at Latinx and Black communities, started to notice something different. Teachers were right at the top, right? Social workers, counselors, nurses, and began to ask ourselves as we were looking at this, like, what is this signaling for us? Because arguably, depending on where you're at and what rank, you could be making a lot of money, but there is this conversation, is income really the driving force? Or what else is driving individuals to pursue a college degree? So in this, we began to play with this, and we realized that it's actually not income, but service, care, and social advancement were sort of driving forces. And so, while I won't get into the index that we created, I will say that from that point, we began to develop a new sort of category to redefine what we understood to be the value of those occupations. And from there, instead of using income as a measure, we computed an index, which again, I won't get into all the details today, but we computed an index that instead of using income, there was another variable that allowed us to measure their commitment to the profession by how long they had been in the profession. And so we used that variable and took out income. And actually, when we computed the index, service, care, and social advancement were stronger predictors of where individuals actually went on to pursue their professions than the Duncan Index, which actually was really rooted in income. And so it shows, right, just an example that using sort of a critical race lens, again, rooted in the stories and voices of our own experiences going through school and the value of a college degree, and then taking that to then say, how do we go in and study the data? Where are the origins of these data sets and origins of these, these measures or indices that we use often or we don't trouble? And how can we redefine that data? And then from there begin the process of developing our ongoing analyses, and then fundamentally the stories that come out of that, because we're rooted in a structural analysis. So we wanted to come back to the question, what does this tell us about the pathways, the journeys, the opportunities or lack thereof that for many communities of color, mediate their ongoing professional and educational development? So wanted to stop there because I know we want to give enough time for Q&A, but I wanted to just share just a brief example that kind of unpacks what our thinking was as we applied and think through like a QuantCRIT framework, how it really shaped our decision-making around data. So I'll stop there and we're going to open it up to some questions. And I think we're almost like right on time, which makes me really happy. So I'm really, really happy about that. So I see Jason, you're on the screen with us. and looking forward to having a dialogue here. So Jason and Lindsay, I see you both on the screen. So
great. So I think I'm going to kick us off. First, I'll just start out by saying thank you so much for letting us all sit in on your coffee talk and really learn from this great conversation. I think we should do this more often on Friday afternoons. So we'll hang on to this time. Apologies to the West Coasters for whom I guess it's just turning to be afternoon. So we've been following the chat. Jason and I have done our best job possible of pulling out questions from the chat. Here's one that we're going to start off with. Since it was in the chat, I'm going to identify it as coming from Beth Tipton. And we saw a lot of +1s on this questions in the chat. So it's a little bit long. It'll give you a lot to think about. Can you talk about how critical perspectives relate directly to the statistical methods used versus the questions asked, the variables used, and the interpretation of results? So what she's asking is about the underlying statistical theory. She asks, is there a problem with hypothesis testing? Is there a problem with regression as a method? Or is the problem with how these methods are implemented in research? And it's not directed towards any of you. So I think, it would be great for, when the spirit moves you, you can jump in.
Well, I just finished chatting. Go ahead.
Well, and Beto and I talk about this a lot, actually. Like, it's always, we get these questions of how do you do it? And the relationship with the theory and the actual methods. And I would say at this juncture, as critical race feminist scholars, we're grappling with that question itself. Can we retool it? So like I had previously said, we are in its infancy. I'm not sure. We're still laying the theoretical underpinnings for much of what we're doing. And so that's why in QuantCRIT, you see a lot of descriptive stuff. And we get critiqued often for descriptives and using secondary data. But I think one thing that we're trying to do is be responsible with what the questions we're asking and like who we are, how we are entering this work and who we're entering it with and for. But yeah, we have these conversations consistently. These questions are always brought up. I think that sociologists of color are really grappling with that. Tifuku Zuberi has a lot that he's doing around the methods themselves. And so, Beto, you can chime in here about conversations we've had too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this is, and this is, I think, sometimes true generally when we engage sort of critical frameworks, I think, and methods are critical, just thinking about just methodological decision-making. I think we start usually from the place of thinking about the method and then kind of work back. And I think what we're trying to say is that we need to start the other way around. And I think it's a challenge. I mean, we've had this presentation before, and I think Nichole and I have said, like, we don't have a magic wand for how to do regression analysis differently, or how to, a t-test is a t-test, right?
I swear.
Yeah. So, I think that there could be possibilities? Surely. I mean, I think that I'm wrestling with, I've shared this work with Nichole before. There's a beautiful colleague of mine, Philip Stevens, who does work on Apache mathematics. And I've been just blown away, like where he's talking about how what we train in schools and traditional, is on a third plane, Euclidean tessellation, yet Apache mathematics come from a very different orientation of how we understand math. And so a lot of times Apache youth, when they go through school, end up thinking that they suck at math when they're actually genius. But we never see that because we're working on two very different planes of how we understand and compute and analyze the world mathematically. So work like Philip Stevens, I think, will open up for us a space to think very differently about the actual computational tools. But I think the goal for, and I don't want to overspeak here, Jay, but I think the goal for quantitative criticalism and QuantCRIT is that we have for too long have disconnected the theory from the method, and we're trying to bring that back in really intentional ways. And if we do that, maybe it's not so much about doing the regression, having a new regression, but ultimately how we employ that regression through the kinds of decision making that we do, and ultimately what does that regression say about our world or say about the social phenomena under study. So that's what I would add to that conversation. And I know Jay, you wanted to jump in also.
Gosh, I love this stuff so much. I'm so jazzed right now. So the first thing I wanted to mention is that, like, this really underscores the contours of the broad umbrella of quantitative criticalism. And I think from a QuantCRIT perspective, it may be approached differently than other critical frameworks. And I'm going to give an example. Like earlier I said, Stage and Wells noted to be adaptable and not dismissive of the potentials of quant research, which some may call incrementalism. And incremental change, according to CRT, is rooted in white dominance. And so that's something that we don't often talk about in the beautiful mosaic of quantitative criticalism, that there may be different approaches based on the theoretical, conceptual, and epistemological foundations that we're situating our studies. The second thing, I'm going to just briefly speak about methods. And I know this is going to sound adaptive and not dismissive. Regression basically regresses to the mean of a line. It is the line of best fit. It is the line of white fit. And so it is inherently a dominant subordinate methodological tool. So then the next step for me says, okay, well, I like structural equation modeling because it gets at the nuances of relationship between constructs. But as we know methodologically, the computational foundation of SEM is rooted in regression. So like it is still a best fit scenario. And I think that, as we said earlier, we have to be explicit about our intentions and the tensions and considerations while still employing these to be critiquing our vehicles while also moving that vehicle towards liberation. It requires a really nuanced storyline for the papers that we write and the work that we produce.
Perfect. Great. Thank you.
Great. Thank you all. And I'll just echo Lindsay's comment about this, sort of the fabulous discussion that you've set up for us. And I think the next question sort of builds off this first one. And there was a discussion in the chat during your presentation about the idea that sort of, math doesn't lie, but the interpretation does. And then, some engagement about, well, the math is based on assumptions. And I think, Jay, you just sort of addressed that directly. And you talked a little bit about generalizability. So I'm wondering if you all could comment on some of the assumptions in quant methods that might conflict with a critical quantitative approach or a quantitative critical approach.
I'm curious, so the assumptions in terms of, I guess I'd be curious to know what they mean by what types of assumptions, like assumptions of neutrality, or are they referring to a different kind of assumption?
Yeah, no, there weren't any specific assumptions mentioned, but maybe just sort of generally, about, again, Jay, you sort of talked about, sort of the goal of generalizability as maybe sort of a goal or an assumption of quantitative methods. Are there others that, you're wrestling with?
An assumption of significance, right? Like for instance, indigenous communities, like how do you, disrupt the asterisk, right? Less than 1%. I think that, I'm sure many people are very uncomfortable with this dialogue right now and what we're saying. Which is completely okay. I think that, those assumptions of is this significant should be challenged because, again, what are the communities we're entering and why are we entering it? And do we know enough history about them to then advance what it is that we're trying to achieve? So I think we can go back to how we think about hypotheses and correlations and significance, and we could do that dance all day. But again, what theory are we implementing and why are we implementing it, right? Is it towards racial justice aims? Is it towards, I think Jay, you gave a really good example of regressions and the best fit, all of that, right? All of those are really great examples. And I think there is no clear answer. And I think we keep revisiting that and it's so frustrating. But the conversations I think are around the ethics of doing harm. Are we doing harm? Like what have they been used for traditionally? And we're just having those conversations and we are unfolding them as we go. But, I think an assumption like we could grapple with those all day depending on what it is, the analysis we want to do, factor analysis, like you had said. So I don't think that's a great answer, but it's an attempt.
With this question, I'm thinking about structural equation modeling again, and in particular measurement models. I would very much like to talk much more in quantitative critical spaces about measurement theory and measurement and variable operationalization, because I think it has such direct ties to policy implications. And I'm on some of my scholarship as an example, how researchers operationalize gender can have transformative impact on people and on communities. And I think that the importance of that gets lost after the research design, and particularly when I think we need to be better and more critical about questioning measurement operationalization and recognizing that there is no unified truth or measuring the human experience. And there's a lot of subjectivity in how we develop measures. And I'm just talking about social identities right now. I'm not even talking about behaviors and characteristics and traits, or even, academic achievement outcomes. How we operationalize so much is having a direct imprint on how policy is developed, which is terrifying to me in so many ways.
Jay, you'll be happy to know that we definitely are planning a session exclusively devoted to measurement, which will be coming up. So I'll use your comment as an opportunity to pat ourselves on the back, and I'm going to move on to the next question if that's okay. So this question is probably impossibly broad, just like all of the questions are impossibly broad. But in our audience today, we have many people who are responsible for training the next generation of scholars in educational research. I appreciate Nichole's observation that, this field is in its infancy. Everybody's still kind of finding their way. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about implications or advice for teaching quantitative methods. And I would love to hear your responses, both as you think about individual instructors, but also more at the systems level. What should we be looking at in sequences of courses, in systems, in schools, and in how we're training our researchers?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I could probably respond a little bit to that just because I'm currently trying to design such a class, particularly for teachers. So for future math teachers, thinking about methods. But I think, for me, I approach my pedagogy deeply rooted in notion. So I use popular education, which basically starts from kind of the lived experiences of communities and brings that directly into the topics and ideas we're talking about in class. So curriculum is in many ways co-constructed with kind of the local setting. So I live here in Western Washington University, where Western Washington University is located. We're surrounded by local nations, and I'm privileged to work with some incredible colleagues who have deep partnerships with these communities. And we've been thinking a lot about what it means to redefine STEM and science and math. How do we approach it differently? What kinds of things do we teach? And so I'm deeply impacted by the ways we're reimagining the teaching of quantitative tools or math in this way. But I would argue that, if anything, like some of the big takeaways for me is that the class can't just jump into methods. You have to start with the history of those methods. So I think as a starting point, grounding the students into a history of how these methods have been employed, to what end. Case studies are also really, really impactful to raise questions. I think Nichole was alluding to this around significance. Like, I was just working with a colleague who does work in rural communities, who was often told by her professors, your community doesn't have enough people in it to run an analysis. Using those kinds of cases and wrestling with the tension. So it's not about, providing folks like a clear path, but like, how might we approach this? What are some ways, embed sort of creativity in the ways we think about cases. So case study for me is an important pedagogical tool that I think could have a really powerful place in a quantitative classroom or a quantitative methods classroom. But I think for me, it starts with history. Like, we need to first unpack history of these methods and tools. That's a starting point, I think, for any classroom that wants to envision a more radical space or more critical space around these topics. And I'll let my colleagues jump in here.
Yeah, I'll speak to that. So over the course of the summer, Mike Russell out of Boston College gathered a collective of us that write on this: sociologists, education scholars like Ezekiel Dixon Ramon, who's at Penn, Eduardo Bonaceva, all of us, Nancy Lopez, I, met to redesign curriculum for education. And so we have, I think, labeled ourselves as anti-racist critical methods folks. And so that was just part of an ongoing conversation, which I believe will eventually turn into textbooks and then curriculum that's launched out. So there is more coming out. It's just, it's in the works, right? So we're working on the redesigning and thinking through. And I would argue that, they did a heavy lift because I wasn't in all of the meetings, but we started with ontology, axology, epistemology, and the questions around that. And really, like Michelle Fine, really posing these critical questions. So it all started with the questioning and then the intention behind where we're going with this. So that's coming. I can't tell you when, but it's coming. So just stay tuned. And if you have those folks coming in, even better.
I'm excited about that. Can't wait for it to come out. I have a lot of thoughts about this. The first is I think we have to address the historical harm that cisgender heterosexual white men have done to us in teaching methods, and the predominance of cishet white men teaching methods historically in education. And I think this is especially true for communities who have been harmed through essentialist views of truth and numbers, where we're not supposed to see ourselves in quantitative inquiry except as people who are less than or harmed by or a deficit to. I think doing so will require us to rebuild quantitative interest so we can increase representation of quantitative methods instructors. And for both students and instructors, I think one way of doing it is by connecting quantitative methods to social change. And then lastly, I just want to say, I don't think this should be a discussion of we should add a quantitative criticalism elective. I very much oppose that idea because I do not think we should be separating instruction on methodology and epistemology, because doing so places a huge amount of labor on BIPOC faculty, queer and trans faculty, and disabled faculty to hold up oppression-based, liberation-driven instruction when folks teaching methods without epistemologies feel like they can speak objectively to numbers instructions alone.
Great, thanks. I realize we're almost out of time, and I think we probably have time for about one more question. And there was, you all have offered a lot of food for thought and a lot of ideas. One thing that we hope will come from this series, and certainly some of this webinar and some of the subsequent webinars, is sort of some of the how. So there was a question that came in about, I'll maybe end with this, about sort of what stances or practices of QuantCRIT would you all recommend to sort of the multiple audience members that are joining us today from multiple associations? And this question also sort of said, is this are these stances or practices just a matter of preference, or should you really just choose one approach or one stance? And so maybe that you can answer that from a perspective of, is there a specific approach or stance or practice that you'd like to leave folks with as we wrap up the webinar from a crit quant perspective?
I want to be like all of them, and we still got to add more probably. I don't know if so. Again, I think that, and maybe I might be overspeaking. So Nichole, please push me here, and Jay as well. But when Gilborn and the folks that are part of the special issue were putting forth the tenets, it was really to help to kind of tease out particular components, but they shouldn't be seen as separate. This really is a collective. This is a whole stance, right? But it's like for ease of explanation, for ease of detailing and providing. But to me, there is a deep imperative. And I say this as someone who was both deeply impacted by STEM classes. Clearly, I didn't go into engineering, I was trying to do engineering for 3 years and that didn't happen. But I also think about the ways that these statistics have framed us. Like for me, this is a deep wound that we all carry, right? That's how these numbers continue to shape our lives. And so I say this with the most loving ways. Like there's a political imperative for us to think deeply about all strands of this work at each step of our methodological decision making. It doesn't mean that it's going to be perfect. I'm like, man, I didn't really think about this component here, and I need to do a better job when I go back and revisit the work to really deepen my lens around data mining, for example. When I mine data from the census, how do I do that with a deep commitment to QuantCRIT? So I don't do it perfectly, but it's the challenge of how we do it. I know we're running out of time, so I would say that. Nichole and Jay, I'll let you step in here.
Yeah, I think often in Vero and I talk about a lot, we don't own these ideas. We put them out there, right? There is an intellectual genealogy that we follow, that we give credit to, but it is our hope that folks out there who are training the next generation can take it up and run with it and teach us how things are. As faculty, we don't get all the time in the world to read anymore, or just think about one method at a time. So we're asking this next generation help us. And then for me, personally, this is about lives. Like, it's not just a number. Like, that number is going to matter, especially right now in a pandemic when communities of color are suffering and dying. Like, that matters, how we're measuring race and ethnicity. So for me, it's about life and death, and how you interpret that could be either assuming it this way or that way. But it's not, I don't get the privilege of choosing what one I do. I have to do it because I am a part of it and for communities in this anti-racist struggle. So that's how I think about it. Jay?
Quickly, just recognize that the Academy pushes us to center our ego and our own individual recognition. And we must recognize that's very tied to labor and capitalism. And if we are to approach this work, we have to do it in solidarity and community. And that's especially a call into white people who want to approach quantitative criticalism.
Well, I'm going to, like I said before, I think we could just talk all afternoon, but unfortunately, we're constrained by a thing called time. So I just want to cut us off there, I suppose, for now, and just say thank you again to our speakers and to everybody who joined us today. We are putting this together in service to our communities, plural. And so just a second reminder to please be on the lookout for a survey, which will be an imperfect tool to collect data, but which will give us some feedback and provide us some guidance on what future sessions we can put together to be in best service to everybody grappling with these ideas. Please be on the lookout also for a second webinar. It will be sometime in early 2022, more on that later. And there will be a recording of today's webinar available on the SRI website, and we encourage you to share it widely. So just thanks again to our speakers and to everybody for being here, and wishing everybody a great and restful weekend.